Welcome back to the FM Garage. I'm Mike, and this is episode 4 of the Stage 1 Turbo Kit installation series, where this time we're actually going to get to put together the turbo. Alright, now is finally the time to assemble our turbo, manifold, and cast outlet together as one assembly before we bolt it onto the engine. So here we'll cover all the parts and the tools that are necessary to be able to make all this happen. Of course, starting off, we have our Garrett GT2560R turbocharger. We also have the FM cast manifold and outlet housing. So these are the main pieces, and then over here we have some of the smaller bits and the hardware. This is the 8 psi Wastegate Actuator. This is the new bracket that's required to be able to use it with this turbo in this orientation of clocking the compressor housing. And then all of the hardware over here, this is a couple of bolts and some washers for the Wastegate Actuator bracket. We also have a hose fitting or hose barb for attaching to the compressor housing, so that way we can have a boost source for that Wastegate Actuator. We have an oil feed adapter. This is a special fitting, a 7/16 by 24 male inverted flare fitting that'll go into the turbocharger, and then sticking up like this we'll have a -4 male adapter fitting, so that way when we have our oil feed line coming from up off the engine, it'll be able to attach to this to feed oil to the turbocharger. Now, to connect our turbocharger with the turbo manifold, we have this hardware right here at the back of the table, starting with the Inconel studs. So these are special studs made just for our kits. You can tell that they're a different one, that they come in these special prepackaged tubes. They're also a slightly shorter length than the standard stainless steel studs. And you can see that the shoulders right in the middle are in a different spot, and they're a little bit different lengths. So there are 4 of these Inconel studs. There are also 4 of the Stage 8 locking hardware nuts, little flags or locating pins, and then also these C-clips. So all of this hardware is intended just for the manifold and the turbocharger. Now, as far as tools that you'll need, we of course have a torque wrench. This one is a fancy digital one, but a mechanical one will work just fine. You'll need to have something that can go down as low as either 11 pound-feet, or that's 132 pound-inches, up to about 24 pound-feet, which is about 290 pound-inches. Other than that, I have an arrangement of just wrenches and tools. I have a couple 13mm wrenches over here. I also have a 7/16 wrench, and then a ratchet, along with a 9/16 deep socket, and then also a 13mm deep socket. I also have a set of pliers, and then a little bit of thread paste. Besides this, you also need a little bit of engine oil, because we will need to add a little bit of lube to the oil fitting at the top of the turbocharger. So now we just need to put together a few items onto the turbocharger before we get it mounted to the manifold and attach the turbine housing. So let's talk about the turbo first. Just to give you a few identifiers to help you take a look and check to make sure that everything is oriented properly. Here's a few easy steps to look at the different orientation of parts. So this is the oil feed at the very top of the cartridge. You can see here's the tag to identify the turbocharger. So this oil feed here, you can see that this bolt is directly in the middle, or located just above it. Now, this is the top of the turbine that you'd see if you were looking at the very top of the engine. You'd see right here on top with the wastegate arm, and of course this flange at 90 degrees to this fitting. So this is correct in this orientation. Now, looking at the compressor housing side, you can see that if you're looking from the top, this outlet is pointing down and kind of in towards the engine just a little bit. Looking at the top here, you can see that these 2 bolts, which are going to later house the actuator bracket, are also kind of splitting the difference between the center line of that bolt on the turbine housing. Now that we've checked the orientation of the turbocharger to make sure that everything is correct there, now we need to bolt on a few extra pieces before we attach it to the turbo manifold and the cast outlet piece. First up, we're going to attach the oil feed adapter fitting to the top of the turbo. So this is the male inverted flare. It's a 7/16 by 24 on this end, and then this end is the -4AN fitting that will attach to the braided stainless steel hose that's coming off of the engine block that feeds the turbo with oil. So this side, that's the male inverted flare, because it is a flare fitting, it does need to have a little bit of oil on the flare to help it from galling up to be able to seal correctly. And we'll put a little bit on the threads too, that way we can make sure that it's nice and snug. So I'm using a little bit of engine oil. This doesn't need to be anything specific, and just a little bit will do. You don't need to go crazy. So I'm just smearing on a little bit of oil there on the threads, and a little bit there on the flare itself. There we go. So that's plenty. Doesn't need anything but more than just a light coat. Now I'm going to thread this into the top of the turbocharger. And it will thread down by hand pretty easily. To snug it up, you'll need to use a deep 9/16 socket. This will have to be a fairly thin-walled socket because you'll have to also fit it between this bolt on the turbine housing. So there's not a lot of space there. This in particular is a Craftsman. I'm sure that there are plenty of other brands out there that offer thin wall sockets. This is also a 6-point socket, which may help as far as the wall thickness is concerned. If you don't have access to a thin wall socket, you can also take a little bit of the material off here. You can see this one's actually been ground down a little bit. This may be a bit on the extreme side for most people, but if you need to, this is an option. But we're just looking to drop that on there, give it a little bit of a snug. So this one, if you are not comfortable with just snugging up the surface like this, then we're looking at doing roughly 11 pound-feet, which is about 132 inch-pounds. So you can use a torque wrench if you have one that goes down that low, but this is a flare fitting, so much like the AN fittings that we've already put together for the oil feed line on the engine, this one you're looking to snug it essentially. So now that this adapter has been threaded into the turbocharger, the next step is to remove these two bolts that attach this retainer plate on the back of the compressor housing. These are 13mm head bolts, and we'll just take them out. Along with the retainer plate, just like that. So these bolts that we just took out will not be reused. Instead, in their place, we're going to be using the shorter of the two bolts that were included with the hardware packet that you got. And they're just a bit longer than the bolts you took out. Now the reason being is because this new adapter bracket, essentially for the actuator, is a little bit thicker metal, so the bolts do need to be a little bit longer. So we'll go ahead and place this here. It'll be a retaining piece for the compressor housing, but it's also going to give us another mounting surface for the actuator. Now I'm just threading these in by hand for now. These do have slots on the back of this plate, so there's a little bit of adjustment that can be had. So this is finger tight, and with it like this, there's a bit back and forth movement, and that's necessary because we'll want to have the actuator placed just right. That way, if it has any trouble binding on this rod, we can alleviate that by moving it back and forth. This actuator is held in place with two bolts that attach to the front of this new actuator bracket. These will use the two longer bolts that were included with your hardware package, and then also the 6 washers that were included. So these washers are used to add preload to the wastegate actuator itself. To start off with, you want to install it without any preload on the actuator. So what that means is that we're going to load up each one of these bolts with 3 washers apiece, just so that way we keep them handy, because you'll likely want to add some preload later. Adding preload to the turbocharger will increase the boost just a little bit. So now that we have those washers loaded up on the bolts, we are simply going to then prepare the wastegate arm here on the turbocharger for the rod. And right now you can see there's this little C-clip that's on the rod itself. This is just a retainer for the wastegate actuator rod arm. Now this little C-clip, it is essentially a spring, and it's clamped onto that rod, which is good until you go to take it off. Now when you take it off, it's likely going to go flying. These little things are allergic to humans, so they want to get away from you as quickly as possible. A good solution to making sure that you don't lose this little guy is by taking a big bag, you know, a Ziploc bag, a Walmart bag, whatever, and putting it over this assembly, and then using some pliers to be able to pinch it off of there. That way when it does fly off, you don't lose it. You can also hold a magnet up to it while you're taking it off. That way, hopefully if it's a strong enough magnet, when you take it off, it'll just stick to the magnet instead of going flying off into Never Never Land. So because we're doing this on camera, I'm going to show you how to take it off here just with pliers, and we will be extra careful not to let it go flying. So the easiest way to do it is that you can see that on this side, this top side, is that these are the 2 teeth on the open end, and then this side right here is the back end. So I need to be able to push this clip off towards the turbine side, basically. So I like to position my pliers just under it like that, and then on the teeth, and then push. And be careful about how you do this again, because they will go flying. There we go, just like that. So here's that little clip off of the post. Now that we have that off of there, we're going to take our actuator, bolt it onto the front with these bolts and their washers. Now again, I'm just going to run these in finger tight. That way we have a little bit of moving around adjustment and play. Alright, now spin this back around, and you can see this actuator arm has a hole in it, and we're looking just simply to line it up. Now you can see that it's not quite lining up here, even when I've got the actuator arm all the way over with the wastegate arm. So in this case, what I'll need to do is use my pliers and simply pull it over. It'll put a little bit of tension or preload onto this arm, which is okay, but we just want to be able to slot this post into the hole on the actuator arm. There we go. So now press this guy down onto the post. You may need to rotate the arm just a little bit, which is fine. So now you can see that it's over that slot that's on the post. And now, to make sure that that actuator arm doesn't come flying off, because it does have some spring tension on it, it will want to move, especially when the wastegate arm is being moved by the pressure. We'll want to put this clip back on here. So I've set it on there on this side, and it's just the same as taking it off, only slightly less dangerous for losing the clip. So you squeeze it on there like that. There we go, just to make sure. So now that little retaining clip is keeping the arm on there. It's not going to be able to fly off. So now what we want to check is to see here on the actuator, you can see the rod going through. What we will want to see is that this arm is not touching this bracket anywhere. We don't want to see this arm touching the inside of this bracket at all. this actually looks pretty good. So this should mean that we have free movement of this actuator whenever it's pushing the wastegate open. Now to check that, what we can also do is use our pliers again. Now this is under spring tension, so this will be a bit difficult to do, but you'll want to take your pliers and simply turn that arm, and this will show you how that actuator is moving. And in this case, it looks like it's clearing the side of that bracket pretty well. So in this case, this orientation for this bracket, where it is in its position right now, is really good. So now we can go ahead and tighten up these two bolts as well as these two bolts on the front. These are all 13mm bolt heads. So we're going to snug them up just to keep them in position. These bolts, we don't have a particular torque spec on them. We just generally snug them up. They don't necessarily need Loctite because there actually is a bit of tension on them keeping them in place. So putting them in, snugging them up after you've confirmed that the wastegate actuator arm movement is good and the motion is clear of hitting the bracket, then you're good to go. So the last thing that we need to do on this turbocharger is attach our boost source hose barb. So this little threaded hole right here, this is a 1/8 MPT, and that's what this is. So the threads should seal, but we're going to do a little bit of insurance just by adding some Teflon thread paste, just like we have been with some of the other NPT fittings. I gooped it on there a little bit strong, but just like before, you only need a little bit. So I'll smear this around all the way around, and then I'll wipe off the excess. And on these guys, same theory. I generally try to leave the first 2, maybe 3 threads uncoated, just because they don't really have good contact once you thread it in, because the sealing surface will be somewhere about halfway or 3/4 away down the threads. Now that we've got some thread paste on this, go ahead and thread it into the compressor housing. And then this one uses a 7/16, so go ahead and use a wrench here and run that down to where it's snug. Torque spec is not important again, we're just looking for snug. And now that that's in there like that, your turbo is ready to go. So this bracket, you may be wondering why this is on here. You can use this with the soft lines. There's a couple of included P-clamps to help hold your soft lines in place. So you want to leave this bracket on here. These 2 bolts right here are not really used in this setup at all. So you can either leave them here in the compressor housing as is, or you can take them out. That part's up to you. The holes don't go all the way through, so they're not going to hurt anything if you take them out. But otherwise, this turbocharger is now ready to go onto the manifold. Now that we have the turbo put together, we need to get the manifold ready to mount it to. So with this manifold, you've got 4 studs that'll be mounted in these 4 holes, and these are going to use the Inconel studs, the ones that come in these little protective sleeves. So they just need to be removed from the sleeves, and then you can see that they're all of these studs have the same lengths on either side, so they're symmetrical left to right, or top to bottom, whichever way you want to look at it. So these guys, we can start just threading them in by hand. You should be able to get them pretty much all the way down just by threading them in with your fingers. If you have any trouble doing this, you may need to pull the stud back out. Just look down in the threads, make sure there isn't any schmuck that's in there, and use compressed air to blow it out. Now that you have the studs installed finger tight, we're going to torque them down to spec. So these studs should be torqued into this manifold at 24 pound-feet, or about 290 pound-inches. So an easy way to do that is to take a few nuts that are the correct thread. I'm just going to use these two ones that are actually from the Stage 8 locking hardware kit. These have flanges on them. If you got the hardware installation toolkit or tool bag that was an option for the kit, then you should have a set of nuts actually specifically for this that would have come with the drill and the tap. But it doesn't really matter. I'm going to use these ones because that's what I have handy. So I'm going to take one of these nuts with the flange facing up, normally what you wouldn't install if you were trying to tighten something down, and install it like that, and then take the other one and install it flange to flange. So what I'm doing here is simply putting it to where both flanges are together, and then I'm going to take a wrench on the bottom and a wrench on the top and tighten them together. So I'm tightening against the nuts, basically top to the bottom, bottom to the top. So now that I have those tightened against each other, I can actually use the top one now to tighten the entire stud. So I'm just going to snug it down like that by hand, just lightly, and then I'm going to go back and torque it down with a torque wrench. So I've got a fancy digital one. You don't have to have a fancy digital one, but run this up to 24 pound-feet, and then tighten it just to 24 pound-feet or 290 inch-pounds. There we go. All right, so now once we've got that torque down, you simply put your wrenches back on to the two nuts, and then you loosen the top one from the bottom. There we go. So they'll be pretty snug by now, of course. And then loosen the bottom one and just take it off of there. There we go. So now that we've got that torqued down, we'll just repeat the same process for the other three, and then we'll be ready to mount the turbo. Our in-canal studs are now fully installed. At this point, if you wanted to, you can go ahead and install the studs into the turbine housing, the other stainless steel ones that have the asymmetric threads on either side of the shoulder. Or you can also go ahead and mount the turbo. I'm going to go ahead and mount the turbo now because that makes it a little bit easier to hold on to everything. So it doesn't really make a difference here, but I'll show you how to mount the turbo. So of course, the turbocharger is going to be mounted this direction. You can see the Flyin Miata logo on top, and then we'll have the side with the actuator on the turbo here, mounted to face the top side of the manifold where that logo is. So when you do this, you will have a little bit of play. That doesn't really matter. I like to line it up just by feel. Even if you have this a little bit off, it's not going to make any difference. The way that it's ported on the inside is still going to be able to get all of the exhaust flow into the turbine housing. So now that you have this on like this, then you can take the little mounting ears or Stage 8 locking hardware tabs and the nuts and put them on here. So start off with the nuts, of course. I'm just threading this on by hand. So space is kind of tight here. And on this one, this is probably the easiest one to access. I'm just tightening them down finger tight for right now. This one is a little bit more difficult to access, but there we go. And then the last one. Reach around from the top and the bottom and use both hands to be able to get it started. There we go. Now, these guys, of course, you're not going to be able to really get them torqued down to any particular spec because you can't really get a torque wrench in on most of these except for maybe this one here on top. You can use a wrench and a socket to be able to tighten this one down. We're going to aim for about 24 pound-feet or 290 pound-inches, but you're going to be using a wrench for most of this. So we're looking for snug, not anything crazy. You know, these are stainless steel and ductile steel pieces, so you can go pretty tight without worrying about stripping out the threads. Just don't go Hulk on them. Okay, good and snug. Now, that's where these little winglets come in. So what these are just locking tabs to keep these nuts from ever backing off. Now, the way that these are installed is that they have 12 points on them. That way there's a bit more adjustment as far as fine placement, but they just fit over the nut. Now, of course, right here, they're not going to do anything. We will actually want to spin this around to where it's about like that. So now if this nut were ever to get loose and start working its way counterclockwise to unthread, this tab, because of the way it's positioned over the nut, is going to run into the housing of the turbine. So this guy is going to prevent it from ever loosening up or backing off. And once you have this guy on, then these little C-clips get pressed on and they fit right into the groove there. Some of them, the placement is kind of tight. So like in this one, I'm actually going to have to just use a wrench here to kind of help convince it on. And now you can still see that there's a little bit of motion here, so nothing is bound up. That C-clip is able to rotate just a little bit, and you can see that little wing is able just to rotate just a smidge. So when everything's installed like this and there's a little bit of movement here, that's good. They're not bound on anything. But now this nut is locked in place and it's never going to be able to loosen up more than just that much. Now, these guys are a locking setup of hardware that you should never really have to mess with. But because there's no Loctite or anything like that, if you need to service this, say you need to take the turbocharger off, or you need to be able to take the manifold off, or whatever the case is later on down the road, these pieces just come off like regular C-clips. You take the little mounting tabs off and you undo the nuts just like any other locking nut and stud setup for a turbo. So don't need to worry about heating up any Loctite or anything like that to break it loose. So now that we've got this installed, let's go ahead and I'll do the other ones. And just like that, if you're looking down at the turbocharger from the top of basically the turbocharger mounted to the manifold like this, all of your tabs should be basically pointing in kind of a counterclockwise position. And this is the correct orientation to keep them whenever you're setting them to prevent those nuts from ever backing off. Now that we have this done, we can go ahead and install the studs over here. So this is the same process as what we did on the manifold, but these studs are a little bit different. We're going to be taking the shorter end of the stud and threading it into the outlet. Okay, and then just like this, now that they're finger tight, I can go ahead and use a couple of double nutted nuts on the threads and torque them down to spec. All right, now these studs are installed. As you saw, I torqued them down to 16 pound-feet instead of 24 pound-feet. These are just regular stainless, so they don't need to be quite as tight as the Inconels. Now that these guys are in, of course, we can go ahead and install our outlet. So this is the turbine outlet casting. It's also ductile steel, just like the manifold. Very strong, very reliable. And this simply goes over the studs like this. And now these ones will use Nordlock washers. That's these funny looking two-piece washers. So these have steps in them that prevent hardware from being able to back out. It kind of bites into the metal and prevents it from moving. Now the two pieces, there's also steps between the two pieces, the two washers here, that basically are kind of like steps. They're ramped steps, and so they prevent from turning against each other one direction. Now that direction, of course, is counterclockwise for the nuts, so it helps when you lock them down with a nut. Once it's tight, those teeth grab into everything and they don't allow that particular piece of hardware to back off. So space is tight on these guys. That's the reason why we use the Nordlock washers here and locking nuts. You can see that these ones have a pinched top, so it's a mechanical locking nut. But that's why we use this hardware here instead of using more of the Stage 8 locking fasteners, just because some of the space is really tight and you wouldn't be able to really get those Stage 8 locking hardware pieces on there very easily. So these ones, I'm just going to by hand install all of the Nordlock washers and their locking nuts. There's 5 of these, 3 on the outside and 2 on the inside. And you can only just see the last one down here. This one's very tight to get to. These are all on here hand tight, so now we just need to torque them down. There's not a lot of space, so you probably won't be able to get a torque wrench on most of these, maybe the top 3. We're just looking for about 16 pound-feet. We don't need to do anything crazy, just nice and snug. On these guys, I'll do the same thing, as I'll use a wrench on most of them to tighten them down. But if you want to, you certainly can use a torque wrench on the ones that you can reach. The cast outlet housing is now attached to the back of the turbo, so now the last thing we have to do is attach 4 more studs here to the outlet of the cast outlet. So this is where the stainless steel downpipe is going to mate up. We're going to treat this the same way as we did on the turbo housing, that we take the remaining 4 of these studs and now that they're installed finger tight, same process, we'll double nut them and torque them down to about 16 pound-feet. Now we have the turbo assembly all together and ready to mount on the engine. So you may be saying, hey Mike, where's the gaskets? You didn't put in gaskets between the turbo manifold, the turbo, or the outlet. Well, this particular setup doesn't require any gaskets. Each one of these pieces, the mating surfaces are precision ground, so they're an exact match to the other side. So when you bolt them down and torque them correctly, they're not going to have any issues with any kind of sealing. These guys, in the past when we've tried gaskets, would actually blow out. So if you do try to put gaskets in between these connections, because of how hot the temperatures get at this turbocharger in this location, you're probably going to blow out the gasket, and then you'll be back in here taking this back apart to put it back correctly the next time. So don't put any gaskets here. You don't need any kind of sealant, any kind of high temperature goop, nothing like that. They're machined surfaces ready to go together just like this. Now that's the same story here on the cast outlet. From this 4-bolt flange to the downpipe that's included, it's also machined, and so is the surface for that downpipe. So once we get to that point, this doesn't need a gasket either. This surface will just bolt up, we'll torque it all down, and then it'll be good to go, no leaks. Our turbo manifold and cast outlet assembly is ready to go in the car, except that we need to do the oil drain line first. So in the kits, there are a hard line as well as a soft line option. We're going to cover the soft line installation on this video. At this point, if you have a hard line kit, there's going to be a separate video for that, so skip ahead to that. You can ignore what we're about to do here for the soft lines. So the soft line kits, it'll come with a billet aluminum flange like this. This will also come with a hose barb like this, and then as well as a paper gasket, 2 bolts, and 2 washers. Now this is all the hardware that's going to be attached here at the turbo. There's also, of course, a hose, some hose clamps, and some heat sleeve, and another hose barb, but we'll get to those later. So what I'll start with is this paper gasket. Now this should be able to seal on its own, but to give us a little bit of added insurance as well as helping it stick to the surface while we're trying to get everything aligned and bolted down, I'm going to add a little bit of silicone RTV. We're looking for something that's got a relatively high temperature resistance rating as well as oil resistance rating. So what we like to use is Right Stuff. You can get this at most automotive stores. You can pick whatever flavor you want, that's up to you. But all we're doing here is I'm just going to apply just a little bit here around the perimeter of the gasket. It doesn't take much. I'm just going to take this little bit and just kind of smear it around the hole. Something like that. This is the only port where oil is actually going to be coming through, so you don't have to do it all the way around unless you just really want to. I'm also going to do a little bit on this side. One just to give us just a little bit more additional insurance and help it to stick and keep in place easy. There you go, just like that. And then you can either stick it to the turbo here, or if it's any easier, you can also stick it to the bottom of your flange like this. Okay, and now this guy is ready to go on the bottom of the turbo like so. And you can see that with that there, with the silicone, it kind of helps keep everything in place pretty easily. Now the next step is I'm going to take the 2 washers and the 2 bolts and simply thread these in by hand at first, just like so. These are 13mm head bolts, just like all of the other nuts and bolts that we've been dealing with here on the turbo manifold and outlet here recently. So these guys, you can snug them down. We're looking for about 16 pound-feet or so, just kind of like all the other hardware. Okay, now we need to apply a little bit of Teflon thread paste to this adapter. So just like what we've been doing for the oil feed stuff, this is the same deal. This is a tapered thread, and we're just going to apply a little bit of sealant right about the middle, skipping the first couple of threads or so. And this is just a dab that we're looking for. Not looking for anything crazy. So now that we've got this, the little bit of thread paste on there, simply thread it into that flange and get it finger tight like that. And now what I'm going to do is take a 11/16 socket. You can also use a wrench, of course, and turn it about 1.5 to 3 times rotation after you've got it snug down about hand tight. We're not looking to really torque this guy down. We're just looking to seat the threads, and about 1.5 to 3 rotations after finger tight should do it for you. The final steps that we need to do before we mount this assembly onto the engine is to attach our oil drain hose and then also set up our water lines that'll come on either side of the center housing of the turbo. So we've already mounted up our drain flange for the oil line. Now we simply need to attach our drain line hose. This is the 5/8 high temperature oil drain line that's included with the kit. So first, before we actually try putting it on here, is we recommend putting a little dab of grease on the fitting and possibly on the hose. You don't need a whole bunch. This is just to help you lube it up to get it on there a little bit easier. I'm just going to apply a little bit of grease on the inside of the hose and also a little bit on the hose barb. So now simply push the hose on like so. Makes it real easy. Then you'll take this constant torque hose clamp. This is going to be clamping this hose onto the hose barb. Slide it down and over. I'm going to mount it this direction. You're welcome to mount it the other way if that makes it any easier for you, but you'll probably want to have the head of this clamp somewhere back here out of the way of the compressor housing. The head on this clamp is a 8mm hex. So I'm going to use an 8mm socket here to tighten that up. There we go. So on these constant torque hose clamps, you can tell that they are fully tight and everything is good to go when the washers are bottomed out against each other. Once they reach this point, you don't need to tighten it any further. You actually can start stripping out the clamp. So once you see the washers bottom out against each other, and you'll usually see some of the bottom washers stop turning and just like the top 1 or 2 washers turning at that point. Once you get to snug for all the washers, that's good to go. So for this oil drain line, now the next thing you can do is take the heat sleeve. This is the larger of the 2 heat sleeves that's included with your turbo kit, and simply slide it over the hose. And this is stretchy, so you can also stretch it over this hose clamp just to keep it in place. And this is simply to protect this oil drain line as much as you can from the heat of the turbocharger. So just stretching it over the clamp is going to keep it in place. If you want to do any kind of additional support here, you could add another hose clamp over the top or use a bit of baling wire if you wanted to. But essentially this part is now ready to go. We have our oil drain line installed. Now we need to do the water lines that'll come into the inboard and outboard side of the center housing of the turbo. So in the kit we've included some rubber hose that has a silicone liner, and this is actually, I've cut it in advance of the installation. It comes as one big hose of 66 inches. I cut it into a 30-inch section and then a 36-inch section. This will be used inboard and outboard. There's also a length of heat sleeve that's included. Again, I've pre-cut this, about 2 feet of it, and I've just cut it straight in half. There's also 2 banjo adapters, 2 banjo bolts, a couple of small Allen head bolts, a couple of washers, and then some crush washers for these banjo fittings, some P-clamps and some pinch-style clamps. So this is what we'll be using to attach the water lines to the turbocharger. We'll start off by using the shorter length, the 30-inch hose for the inboard side. That's here in the tight recess of the turbocharger in the manifold. So what I'm going to do first is actually take the hose and one of the heat sleeves and feed it on. This heat sleeve is not much larger diameter than the hose itself, so you don't want to try to feed this all the way on from the outside to the inside. You want to just do it on one end. So feed it over the hose, and you may need to work it a little bit kind of bunch it up and walk it over the hose until you have it all the way down. There we go. Now that you have the heat sleeve installed on the hose and it's pretty much even with the end of the hose here, we're going to take one of our pinch style clamps. You may need to actually take it apart and spread it just a little bit like I've done with this one, and fit it over the end just like that, and then reattach it. Just to get it started like so. And then I'm going to take one of the banjo adapters and push the hose barb end into the hose. There we go. And then tighten down our hose clamp. Now that we have the water line, heat sleeve, banjo adapter, and pinch clamp assembly all put together, we'll take one of these banjo bolts along with a couple of these aluminum crush washers, feed one of the washers over the banjo bolt, and then push it through the adapter. It'll be a tight fit. Then take your second crush washer, feed it over the threads like so. So we'll have a sandwich of crush washer and adapter. And then we'll take this hose assembly and thread it onto our turbocharger. So you can see that I've got the hose oriented down. This is really the best orientation for this particular side. If you try to feed it up, you'll run into issues clearing some of the hardware on the manifold. Now, the head of this banjo bolt is a 3/4 inch, or you can also use a 19 millimeter. If you can get a very slim-headed ratchet in there with a short or shallow socket, you can do that. You can also use, I'm going to use a 19 millimeter box end wrench here to tighten that bolt. There we go. So we're just looking to squish these copper or these aluminum crush washers just enough to seal them. So now that we've got this oriented to where it's got good clearance on either side, we can move on to the outboard water hose. So the outboard water hose is much the same. It's just much easier to access. So we'll take our length of 36 inches of water line and feed our heat sleeve over it. There we go. So about flush again with the edge of the hose. And then take a pinch clamp and fit it over the end. Undo it if you need to. Okay, just enough to get it started like that. Take our second banjo adapter, feed it in there, and now we can tighten this down. Make sure that if your heat sleeve is walked around at all, that you pull it back into position. That way you're still clamping onto the barb section of the banjo adapter. And you can see that I've got it to where this, as well as the other water line, I have the head kind of perpendicular to the flat surfaces of the banjo adapter. So let's tighten this guy down. Alright, so now on this one, we're not actually going to permanently install the banjo with the washers just yet. I'm going to take the bolt and just put it through for right now, because we just want to get this lined up with the position on the turbo, so that way we can get the bracket situated. And then we're going to take this back out, so that way it's a little bit easier for us to install the turbo assembly when we're hanging it on the engine. Okay, so putting the banjo bolt through here, and just going to get it loosely installed. I won't bother with trying to torque this one down, because it's just about getting the orientation correct at this point. Now that we have these attached, last thing we need to do is run them around and attach them to this bracket, so that way they can face forward to be able to hook up to the water sources on the front of the engine. So on this bracket, what we're going to do is we are going to use the included loom clamps or P-clamps along with the cap screw that's got an Allen keyway in the head and a washer to attach them to this bracket. So I'm going to take the outboard line coming from the far side of the turbo here and mount it up to this one, the top section. And what I'm going to do is use our loom clamp here and see how I've got it to where, at this angle anyway, the bolt is on the bottom, but when you have this mounted up in the car, the bolt is going to be hanging out above the loom and the hose. This will be the same way for this one as well as our inboard line. So here, I'll just pinch this together. You want to orient this to where you've got enough of a length here that it's not putting a real big strain on your banjo on the other side, but you don't want to have it so long that you're running into your exhaust. So somewhere about here, kind of towards the end of where your heat shielding ends and then the bare hose begins, is probably going to be about right. You may want to do a bit of finagling and testing on your particular setup though to make sure that you don't have any clearance issues. Okay, so likewise, we're going to take our other P-clamp, our other bolt, and our other washer, and do the same thing with the inboard line. So this one, it's a much shorter run from where the banjo starts to where the loom clamp is going to attach. We're going to do it the same process where we have the loom clamp holding the hose and having the bolt head on the top relative to when this is going to be mounted in the car, so that way this is hanging down below the bracket. Okay, so now that I have this roughly in place, I'm going to use a 5mm hex. I have it on the end of a 3/8 drive, but if you have a regular Allen key, that works fine too. Just looking for a 5mm hex. So all I'm going to do now is just make sure that my hose lengths relative to how it's attached to these loom clamps is good, that I don't put any additional strain on any of the fittings, but I'm also not running into any of the turbo housing or exhaust manifold or anything like that. And once I'm happy with the position, I'm going to tighten these guys down to lock them in place. So these bolts don't need to be any particular torque, just snug. All they're doing is holding the clamp. But when you're all done, you should have a hose arrangement that looks about like this. You know, nothing's in the way of anything else, but you're also not using up any excess hose, so you still have plenty of length on this end. And as you can see, it's not quite perfect, but I ended up with pretty close to the same length of hose on the far end that'll attach to the front of the engine for the water supply in return. Now, last but not least, what we'll need to do here is this side that we didn't put any of the washers on, I just mocked it up into place. This just needs to come back off. We'll put it back on after we've got the turbo mounted in the car, but removing this will help us get the assembly on the engine, just because this hose is kind of in the way whenever you're doing the initial fit up. So keep this loose, but take this bolt out and we'll put this back on after we have this mounted. Thanks for sticking with us in this video. We covered how to put together the turbocharger, manifold, and outlet. In the next episode, we'll actually put it on the engine in the car. So be sure to check out that video when it pops up. If you have any questions or need any help, feel free to drop a comment down below, send us an email, you can give us a call, and we'll be happy to help you out. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.